Hi, I'm Gary Striegler, and this is the second video in a series about working with miter saws. And this one's going to be on miter saw safety. You know, a miter saw, it's a great tool. You can do all kinds of work, end up with great results, but it's also a tool that if you're not careful can be dangerous. So I want to cover some of the things, to watch out for when you're using a miter saw. One of the first things that I always like to, it's a great rule is you don't ever want to have your finger more than 3 inches or closer than 3 inches to the blade. Now there's a couple exceptions to that I may share later on when I talk about some tricks for using the miter saw, but generally speaking, it's a great idea to keep your hands at least 3 inches away from the blade. So there's two different ways we cover the miter saw. One is material laying flat and one is with material standing up. But either way, it's really important to have the material that you're cutting being in contact with the fence of the saw right on either side of the blade and with the bed of the saw right close to the blade. If I was cutting a long piece of trim like this and it had a crown in it up and down, which this one actually does have a little bit of crown. If I have that crown up, as I complete the cut, at the very end, it's going to break through and pinch the blade, and you don't want to pinch the blade. Now, the same thing is true. I want to be against the fence, so if it's bowed, I want to make sure I turn the bow into the fence so it's making good contact right on either side of the fence. Of course, it'd be a wonderful thing if all the trim that we worked with, all the materials we cut were perfectly, straight and flat, but that's not the real world. So make sure that you're cutting and think about the cut that you're going to make, that you're not going to bind up the piece of trim. And by the way, an important safety thing, if I'm cutting a piece of trim that's pretty long, I either need to get somebody to help and hold that in, or get a work support stand that I can put out there to support it. This particular stand has some pretty decent supports, but they're not going to work for something that's 15 or 16 feet long. And if you're doing baseboard or crown mold, you're going to need to make some cuts like that. So support the work when you're making the cut. Now, one of the biggest things also as a safety thing, and I'll talk about even in getting performance on cuts, but you want to make sure that when you start a cut, you let the blade get all the way up and then let the blade do its job as you make a cut. If you try and hurry through the cut, it can bind the saw up and even cause it to kick up or tear up the material. So take your time making the cuts, let the blade do its job. One of the most important things about cutting with a miter saw is you don't want to go cross your arms over. This would be an example of crossing your arms over where your hands are in the wrong position. I can just as easily operate the saw like this with my right hand holding the wood with my left hand. It is possible though, and I don't know if this is going to show up in the video, I can, if I'm cutting on this side, really swing my body all the way around if I need to cut like this. But for a lot of the time, you can simply just switch hands to make the cut. Of course, cutting back this way, I'd cut this direction. I want to hold, there's a kind of a fine spot between holding the wood close enough to make sure I've got that good contact with the fence and good contact with the base to get the accurate cut and have my fingers in a position that is dangerous. Another thing that can help you a lot, especially if you're cutting smaller pieces, is at the end of the cut, it only takes a second longer, and I struggle with this sometimes, but if you really want to be safe, if you'll leave the saw all the way down until the blade stops and then pick it up, that's the safest thing to do. There's great guards, but still sometimes you can catch a little piece and send it flying. So when I come to my tips that I'm going to share a few tips about cutting small pieces. But one of the things too, this fence is adjustable. You can open it up if you need to make a, pivot the saw to make a cut. But when I'm cutting with this, you know, as a regular miter saw, I want to keep that fence as close as possible to support the work. So you always want to have the fence as close to the blade as you safely can to support the work while you're making the cuts. So just to review, make sure that when you're cutting, that you have the material has to be in really good contact with the fence and the base. And if it's a long piece, you know, make sure that you get some support. Let the miter saw come up to speed and then make the cut. Always think about the cut that you're making. Hold the board to where you can keep it tight against the fence, but not have your hand any closer than 3 inches away from the blade. Another good rule is if you happen to be using a stop of some kind, like if I had a stop set out here, I would want to hold on to the piece that was trapped between the blade and the stop. That's generally going to be the piece that I want to keep anyway. So those are some good general rules. It's not everything about miter saw safety, but it's a good bit about miter saw safety. These are amazing machines. They can do great work for you, but they can also get you in trouble if you don't pay attention. Oh, one other thing. This is a sliding saw, and so on a sliding saw, you want to plunge down and then push forward with the cut. If you try to make a cut with a sliding saw like this and then pull back, it can kind of try to climb cut and come back at you, and that's dangerous. Another thing that crosses my mind, you know, this saw has a good work light that really shows me where the blade's going to cut. So you don't want to be doing anything like this where you've lifted the guard out of the way. Most saws now have really good clear guards also. Make sure that you leave the guards in place, that they're functioning well before you make a cut, and then just trust the work light. If you need to, cut something a little bit long first and then cut it to final length. But whatever you do, don't do anything that's going to take the guard out of play. If you do those sorts of things, you'll get some great results with this saw, and you can use it safely.